just want to give my reaction, I guess, to something I read today. Um, I've mentioned before I'm reading this book about, it's called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. So it's about World War II, specifically Nazi Germany. And, I'm getting towards the end of the book, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to the Holocaust, but somewhat beyond that, right? It was a big portion on the Holocaust, depending on how you define it, but how prisoners of war were treated, how the territories or countries that were taken over, how the people there were treated, a lot of the minorities or the Eastern Europeans, and then obviously the Jewish population, how they were treated. And it, went into some detail around that. And not just, the headlines, if you will, the gas chambers, although it certainly did get into that, but just the treatment in general. Just the inhumane treatment, and I've mentioned before as well, there's lots of diary entries from the German generals and military officers and the like, the SS. So you get a little bit of an insight into their thinking around it too, and it's more or less what you'd expect. I mean, it's pretty horrific. It's pretty disgusting. It's pretty hard to believe, to be honest. And a couple things hit me most potently about it. I mean, there's the obvious, right? But a couple things maybe that stood out particularly for me. One was a particular scene where they were talking about, they were kind of herding together. I think in this case it was Jews, but some population that they decided needed to be exterminated. And it was somebody that gave testimony, I think, at the Nuremberg trials, or it was a diary entry, I don't remember exactly, but it was somebody that was there, and they were explaining how they made the prisoners, I guess I'll call them, the people, I guess I should call them the people that they were about to kill, stripped down naked. And it was families, and it was a big group, hundreds of people. And it just really hit me, the thought of what type of person it takes to make, in this case, there was particularly calling out, there was a father and a grandmother and children, and the grandmother was holding a 1-year-old, kind of trying to comfort it to some extent. And the father was talking to his 10-year-old son, and they said he was kind of pointing into the sky, trying to comfort him, while they're naked in front of these Nazi, SS guards who were clearly about to shoot them in this case. And it just made me think of, like, I can't think of much worse in the world than that moment. And as a father of a relatively young son, the thought of that, to be in such a horrific situation, in so many ways, and to know what was about to happen, and your son knows what's about to happen, and he's probably terrified. And what do you say in that moment? I mean, can it get any worse than that? So that hit me pretty hard. And then again, obviously, it makes you think, like, what type of people would do this, and how could they do this, and just how horrific it was. And obviously I could talk about that for hours, or probably don't want to talk about it for hours, but could. But the next thought it led me to was slavery, interestingly enough. And the reason it led me there is I was thinking about, after I had read the chapter, and there was, lots of talk about the Nuremberg trials and what happened to each of these people. And this one was hung, and this one was, sentenced to life in prison, and this one was murdered. And they actually carried out a lot of the executions of the Nazis at the concentration camps, which was, I guess, a little bit of poetic justice, or whatever you would call it. But there's such vitriol, and there's such, to this day, for myself and others, obviously, hatred and anger towards those people. Because of those types of situations and how horrific it was. And again, I could list 100 others, maybe 1,000 others, right? Other people can. So why slavery? Why to bring me to slavery? Well, without getting political, just trying to be humane about it, it makes me wonder, when and there's a defense bill that's going through now, and I'm not up on all the details of it, so I may butcher some of the facts, and my point isn't to be accurate in that regard, but the point is, there's still this debate about the Civil War and Civil War generals and Confederates and, slave owners to some regard. And listen, I'm not one to sacrifice truth for simplicity. And these things are complex. And the Confederate Army and Confederates and Nazis are not the same thing. And the context is slightly different. But let's just cut to what we do know. We know slaves were treated disgusting, horrific, horrible ways, much like Jews and other prisoners of war and other, people during World War II and the Holocaust. That same scene I just described played out, I'm sure, in similar ways thousands of times over during slavery. Yet, many people, to some extent myself included for a long time, have somehow justified that. Not justified it to say slavery was okay by any means, but somehow have thought of it differently, right? The idea of hanging or putting up a statue to somebody who was trying to protect slavery, the idea of naming something after somebody, an army base or whatever it is, the idea of honoring in any way people who were trying to continue that way of life. Juxtapose that to the Nazis and think about if something was going to be named after Himmler or Goebbels or Hitler or any of these horrific people, what the response would be. And why is it different? Why do we view that differently, right? At its core, right? And they are different, so we should view it differently and treat it with the nuance it deserves. But at a base level, horrible, disgusting things were done to human beings in both these cases. And there were people that allowed it, perpetrated it, encouraged it, flourished in it, enjoyed it to some extent. Those people should never be celebrated. And, at the least, we should be logically consistent enough to look at those two things and say, hey, the burden of proof should be on proving that there's a difference there. We should err on the side of humanity and say, if those horrible things were happening and these people allowed it, or again, encouraged it or enjoyed it in some way or benefited from it, we should err on the side of humanity and say, that's the same. And that's horrific. And we should never celebrate that. Now, if for some reason there's evidence or something that's factual, objectively true that suggests there's a reason to fundamentally treat them differently, listen, I'm open to anything. But to me, it's too close. It's too close to have such a different view of those two things. The way we view slavery, the way we view the South and Confederates and anybody really that supported that or allowed that, or particularly those that, perpetrated it, should be viewed the same, exactly the same as those Nazis that put that family in that one instance through that horrific situation. They don't seem to be different enough to warrant that different of a view on it. And I think for far too long we've allowed that. And it's not okay.